This boy's name was Nate. He was the eldest of two siblings. He had a younger brother who was still in elementary school, and his mother was just a waitress in a coffee shop. Therefore, Nate worked hard to provide for his family. Even though his mother didn't demand anything, he loved his mother and wanted to lighten her life's burdens, which was why Nate invited his best friend, Toffer, to do a side job as a drug dealer. That morning, Nate asked Toffer to meet Brendan, a dealer who already has many networks. Brendan was known to have many colleagues in this business. Unfortunately, Brendan was not a friendly person, especially if he met other people who were racist towards him because he was an adopted child. It would make him so angry. That was what happened to Nate. He talked too casually, not realizing he had offended Brendan. He was driven out of there because of that. Nate already had a job as a pizza delivery man, but because he grew up around drug addicts and consumers, he was sure that this business would bring him a lot of profit. Almost every night, he thought of ways to get into the drug network, so he could penetrate the business until finally he found someone who was said to be a distributor named Joseph Loya. He then went to his office the very next day. He went there using a face mask so as not to be recognized. Upon meeting with Nate, Joseph was actually not sure about his abilities because this job was very dangerous while it was Nate's first time doing it. But in order for Joseph to trust him, Nate admitted that he would not sell it himself and would invite his friends to find new consumers. Joseph said that Nate must at least have a guarantee because if he was caught, he would need a backup plan like an escape house. Because in this business, the most difficult thing was not selling the goods, but running away from the authorities. One day, Nate and Toffer thought about the fact that their house was near the border between America and Canada, and that selling the goods across the border might sound promising, even though they couldn't possibly cross the borders while carrying those goods. Nate had an idea to take another route without having to go through the immigration section, namely the forest that lies between the two countries. Therefore, the next day, Nate and Toffer tried to cross the forest. Initially, Nate thought they would face soldiers or mines in the forest, but apparently there was nothing there, so they could freely cross the border without being caught, and even though it was the first time doing it, thankfully Toffer brought a compass that could lead them to the highway. A few hours later, they realized that they had crossed America and were already in Canada. They were happy because their first mission had been successful. The next step was to find a car to be used to get around in Canada. They also found a cheap car and finally ventured into Canadian territory. But since it was their first time crossing the border with hidden intentions, Nate and Topper were secretly nervous. They were afraid of being suspected by immigration officials. At first, Toffer admitted that they went to Canada to meet their old friends who lived there, and a few moments later, the inspection went smoothly. But suddenly, Nate joked about drugs, making the immigration officer take it seriously. In the end, they had to undergo a second inspection, but when the inspection took place, Nate and Toffer were able to pass because the officers did not find anything suspicious. After that, the two of them went straight to their destination. It turned out that Nate and Toffer went to a place that sold various types of illegal drugs. The seller welcomed them and offered their best product to Nate, who then intended to buy it in large quantities, but the seller apparently did not accept wholesale. He only sold retail and usually sold it directly to consumers, but before Nate and Toffer left, someone suddenly approached them and said that the place had been monitored, so they had to be careful. In the end, they were taken to another place. That person turned out to be selling dried cannabis. Unfortunately, because Nate and Toffer had no experience with this business, they still bought it even though the quality was so low. After leaving the place, Nate and Toffer had to separate. Toffer was asked to cross the forest again while carrying the goods. They argued about the safety of bringing the drugs across forest trails at the border because it was their first time. They knew there would always risk that one of them would not return safely, but on the other hand, bringing the stuff and crossing the immigration section was also the same as suicide. Therefore, Nate insisted that Toffer went through the forest and promised to pick him up 3 hours later at the American border. They even brought a communication device so they could connect to each other if the location was close. After a rather tough debate, they finally parted. Nate then passed through immigration and the officer there asked about Toffer, but Nate lied, saying that Toffer chose to stay in Canada. Finally, Nate could cross the border smoothly, but Nate's good luck was different from Toffer, who was confused while in the forest. He got lost many times and instead returned to Canada until finally he managed to find his way home. Even though in the process, his communication device was connected to another frequency. This made Toffer panic, but fortunately, Nate managed to find Toffer and finally they were able to get back together. In a short time, they managed to sell the goods and get a lot of profit. In fact, they started to be flooded with orders, and because of that, Nate and Toffer planned their second trip, but this time they were suspected by the Canadian police assigned to the roadside. At first, Nate thought that they would be arrested for being caught distributing illegal goods, but the police stopped them for a ticket because Toffer was not wearing a seatbelt. After that, the police asked their destination and Toffer lied, saying that he wanted to go to Creston. Suddenly, the police told them the best drug producer in Canada was in Nelson. That made Toffer and Nate very happy because they didn't expect that the Canadian police would tell them about this secret. Shortly after, Nate and Toffer arrived in Nelson. They took a break to refuel. That was when Toffer met a girl who caught his attention. He then became acquainted with the girl whose name was Nicole. Unexpectedly, she planted cannabis at her house and invited Nate and Toffer to go there. They then followed Nicole until they arrived at her house. Nicole immediately introduced her two new friends to her family. It turned out that her father had a special field to take care of the cannabis. He even developed several new superior types. Of course, those could be sold very expensively because many people were looking for them. They then talk about business. Nicole's father offered a high price for his products, knowing it was superior, so he didn't want it if Nate and Toffer only bought it in small quantities. He asked them to buy at least 150 kilograms and immediately paid $640,000 for it. Nate accepted the offer without any consideration. Meanwhile, Toffer immediately got angry and reminded Nate that they couldn't possibly carry that much stuff. Moreover, they also didn't have cash that much to agree to this offer, but Nate was precisely sure if he could get this. He promised to think of another way so that this transaction could run successfully. Since it was late, Nate and Toffer were staying at Nicole's house. Unfortunately, Nate could not sleep while Toffer spent his time with Nicole, and because of that, Nate chose to work alone and left Toffer at Nicole's house. He secretly took a drug sample, wrapped it, and then swallowed it. That morning, for the first time, Nate crossed the border while carrying goods inside his body, and of course, the inspection was smooth because the officers did not find drugs in the car or his clothes. After that, Nate went to Barry, Brendan's former colleague who also had a lot of networks in this business. When meeting with Barry, Nate felt very nervous, but he tried to show his seriousness in front of Barry and promised that he would not betray him. At first, after seeing Nate, who looked like a geek, Barry ignored his offer. Thankfully, Nate could convince him. Barry then sent someone to check up on Nate and find out about his family. 3 days later, Barry asked Nate to come meet him. He then told Nate about how dangerous the business was, especially since he had investigated Nate's family, so he knew that he had a younger brother and a mother. He threatened to harm his family if he betrayed him. Nate knew that there was no turning back and he agreed to the offer. After that, Nate formed a team consisting of his friends. It was this team that would deliver the goods from Nicole and distribute them in America. Nate called them the Runners. Their job was to bring the goods from Canada through the forest, but so they could cross the trail safely, they practiced running the forest and even wore ghillie suits so they could disguise themselves as bushes in the forest. Their preparations had not been in vain. The first mission as a team was successful. They made a big profit, and according to his promise, Nate gave $3,500 to each of the runners. He also invited them to lunch at a fast food restaurant. After the celebration, Nate told them to keep this a secret, but soon after, someone suddenly came asking Toffer to recruit him because he knew that Toffer and his friends were distributors of drugs. Nate was immediately angry and annoyed because he was sure that one of his friends leaked this secret, and secondly, he was also annoyed because the boy had asked Toffer instead of him, who was the mastermind behind all the actions. Toffer tried to calm Nate down, but on the other hand, he also asked for more profit because all this time he had accompanied Nate as his best friend. But Nate reminded him that he had been busy dating while Nate worked alone. Toffer was offended to hear that and threatened to leave Nate. Nate then offered $7,000, but Toffer asked for $10,000. In the end, because he didn't want to lose his best friend, Nate granted his request because the actual profit he got was far more than that number. In a short time, Nate managed to buy a new house for his mother and brother. They were both surprised and proud because Nate managed to get a house, but her brother had heard that Nate was involved in drug dealing. Nate denied it and claimed that he got that money from trading stocks on Wall Street. His mother didn't mind it even though she knew that Nate was lying. She didn't want to ask any further about where her son could get that kind of money. Since then, Nate and his friends often spent their time partying. Besides working, they also often spent a lot of time going on a spree. They got more and more orders, and even to accommodate the goods, they rented an apartment and went there every day because orders kept coming from all over the country. Nate was getting richer and had more parties, forgetting that he should keep his wealth a secret or this could cause suspicion. Trouble finally came when Brendan found out that Nate had become a dealer too. He was angry because he felt that his area of distribution had been taken over by Nate's group. Therefore, one day, Brendan came to Nate's house, which was holding a party, and attacked to disrupt the party. Nate was angry because Brendan had dared to attack his house, especially when he lived there with his mother and brother. He tried to attack the man, but he immediately ran away. Since that incident, their relationship had heated up. In another place, Brendan paid 2 mercenaries to finish Nate and Toffer off Nate. He paid them so low, it made the mercenaries annoyed. Brendan then guaranteed that the mercenaries could find Nate's money, or at least the drugs in Nate's house. So finally, they were willing to accept the job. Meanwhile, Nate, who wanted to protect his family and friends, invited them to stay at Barry's house until the conditions were safe. But one of Nate's friends, Scuzz, chose to stay at Nate's house with his girlfriend. Nate allowed him as long as he didn't make a fuss there, but unfortunately, the mercenaries hired by Brendan found him and asked him to bring them Nate, but Scuzz admitted that he did not know where he was. He also did not know about Nate's money or drugs because he was not an occupant of the house, but the mercenaries asked him to bring them to find Nate. Finally, Scuzz was forced to follow the mercenaries' orders. Between panicking and wanting to lie, Scuzz pointed to a house and admitted that it was Nate's house, even though he wasn't sure. But the mercenaries went there. It turned out that it wasn't Nate's house. They immediately ran away from there before the problem got worse. Fortunately, the mercenaries let Scuzz and his girlfriend go while they ran away from that place. The next day, Scuzz went to Nate to tell him about the incident. He also demanded a higher salary after saving Nate. The other runners also asked the same thing after getting attacked by Brendan. They wanted a raise and finally Nate agreed. Meanwhile, in another place, Brendan was angry because the mercenaries failed to get Nate. On the other hand, the mercenaries were also mad at Brendan for lying to them. In the end, Brendan and the mercenaries went to the forest to find Nate's money, but it turned out that the mercenaries betrayed and killed Brendan there. A month later, Brendan's dead body was found and became national news. Nate and his friends happened to watch the news and said that it was a good thing because they had lost a competitor, but Toffer was suspicious of Nate, and it turned out that it was Nate that paid the mercenaries to finish off Brendan. He did that to revenge him for disturbing his family. One day, Toffer and the other runners were doing their mission, but this time they brought in a new friend named Ronnie who turned out to be unreliable. In the middle of the mission, Ronnie suddenly asked to stop for a break. He then went to the bush and hid some of the goods for himself. He then returned to the place after the mission to take the drugs earlier, and because of this, the police finally suspected Ronnie, who came from the forest. The police examined him so Ronnie could not do anything other than admit what he had done. Before the police caught Nate, Barry found out about it through his network and immediately told Nate that he had been watched by the police, therefore he must immediately run away and disappear. It turned out Barry wanted to save Nate because Nate had never betrayed him. Then the next day, Ronnie secretly worked with the police to arrest his other friends, and finally all of Nate's friends were caught, except for Nate, who had run away. His mother admitted to the police that she did not know where her son was, so she was considered not to be involved at all in this case, even though she actually knew that Nate was hiding in Canada. She forbade him to come home because the police were looking for him. In his escape, Nate still felt uneasy. He finally returned to America and confessed to his actions. And at this point, Nate actually felt proud of himself because people actually welcomed him warmly, not as a suspect. They did that because they respected Nate's decision to surrender to the police, and after being neglected and belittled for so long, people finally recognized him, who had succeeded in leading the drug smuggling network in America and became one of the richest youngsters in America.